Okay, Assalamu alaikum everybody. Welcome back. Just checking we have all our panelists here. Okay, great. Do we have? Yeah, we've got panelists. Okay, great. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay, Assalamu alaikum everyone. I hope you've had a nice break, some time to stretch your legs. Welcome back to our second panel now. So we had a panel in the last hour where we discussed decisions in terms of whether a PhD is the right thing for you, how to decide what subject to do, when to do it in the right time. And now we'll discuss a little bit more about the actions, such as sort of contacting supervisors, making a good impression, getting the application right, and then steps further after the PhD as well. So we're joined by three excellent panelists here today. So we've got Dr. Usaama al-Azami, who is a departmental lecturer in contemporary Islamic studies at the University of Oxford. He completed his BA in Arabic and Islamic studies at Oxford and his MA and PhD in Near Eastern studies at Princeton University. And his research focuses on Islam and modernity, particularly Islamic political thought. We also have Dr. Mohamad Meki, who is the Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah Fellow in Islamic Finance at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies, and is also a departmental lecturer at the Department of International Development. He holds degrees from LSE and Cambridge in Finance and Economics, and he completed his DPhil at Oxford in Economics as well. His research focuses on microfinance and small firms in developing countries. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Mohamady El-Gaby, who is a postdoctoral researcher in neuroscience at the University of Oxford, and is also the co-lead of the Muslim Researchers Network. He completed his undergrad at Oxford and his master's at UCL before completing his PhD at Cambridge in neuroscience. His research is on neural mechanisms of cognition with a focus on abstraction. Great, so let's jump right in then and get started. So the first thing that kind of sort of naturally follows from where we left off in the last panel is now that we've decided we want to do a PhD and we've maybe thought about which field we want to do it in and is the right time for us. In terms of the application process, how do we stand out in interviews? What sorts of tips can you give in terms of the interview, the written application process? And I know that some of you are also involved in terms of selecting PhD students now or students to take on as researchers under you. So is there any advice you can give, both from your own personal experience doing a PhD, but also now being on the other end of it and having researchers under you? So if we start with maybe Dr. Usaama.
Well, so that's Assalamu alaikum, and thank you, Hannah, for hosting the session. Thank you for the ISOC to arrange it. I've jumped in a little late, so to speak, in the entire process. So forgive me if I'm sort of not entirely sort of systematic in the way in which I present my responses. So the three of us, Mohammed Meki and myself, are in three very different fields. So I'm in the humanities, Mohammed Meki is in the social sciences, and Mohammed is in the sciences, hard sciences, so to speak. So I can only speak for myself, and I think everyone will hopefully sort of put in comments which are in accord with their own fields. In my case, I mentioned off the bat, generally we don't have interviews. I did my PhD in the US, and there we did actually have an interview. So they flew us out they flew me out from the UK, and they put us through a process of interviews which lasted a full day, kind of a day and a half. But that's very unusual, I think, and I don't know about the other fields here, but they'll comment on that. Here, it's mainly about the application itself. And I think at the end of the day in the humanities, it's a question of how clear is your proposal, how viable is the project that you're working on? Because at the end of the day, you are bringing a proposal to, your application is a proposal for a project which will preoccupy you for 3 to 4 years, and you'll write 80,000 to 100,000 words about it. So how clear is that project that you have, and how sort of strong are your credentials that signal that you can actually carry this through to its conclusion? So I'd say that, like in very brief terms, that would be some of the key concerns, and I can elaborate further as the questions come through, as it were.
Great, thank you so much for that. And you touched on something that we'll talk about a bit later as well, in terms of doing a PhD in the US and how that differs. But so Dr. Mohammed, would you like to add anything on that front?
Okay, Bismillah, thanks to the ISOC for organizing this talk. I'd reiterate what Usaama said, which is that we're coming from different fields, so everyone should take our own personal experiences because they're unique, and also just try and think about what the norms are within a particular field. And my field, social science, there's no norm around an interview either. It's your application, but the reference letters are also very important. The reference letters are some of the most important things as well, actually. So these days in economics, the trend has become to do like an RA job or a pre-doctoral fellowship before even applying for a PhD. I mean, it's become a bit silly now in terms of people doing like 3 or 4 year pre-docs before applying for like a top PhD program in the US. At some point, people are going to have to push back on that because it's not really reasonable, I think. But it's become very competitive, and it's all about who you get your letter from, right? So, can I do an RA job for Raj Chetty at Harvard or Esther Duflo at MIT or something? Because then they're going to write me a letter for my PhD application. So the letter is important, but then, as Usaama said, it's the basics of the proposal, really. Does it seem like a reasonable proposal? Is it like self-contained, and does it show that you're kind of aware of the literature, the protocols? The reality is that, I'm not sure how it is in other fields, but most of us are aware that when you start a PhD, you come in with a particular proposal, and it inevitably changes a lot during the process of your research. And everyone knows this, right? And so it's like, we're aware of this, but at the same time, you have to have like a self-contained proposal when you're applying, even if things will change completely. You have to come in with something that seems reasonable from start to finish, in terms of methodology, contribution to the literature, etc. And yeah, as I said, the interview is important. Well, we don't have an interview. The proposal is important, and the references are quite important.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed. Let's move to Dr. Mohamady.
Assalamu alaikum. First of all, thank you to everyone who has been involved in organizing this, and for the panelists. It's been great so far. I agree with the previous 2 panelists that the process is somewhat heterogeneous across fields, but even within fields. For the hard sciences, interviews are usually done for PhD. So you will apply, and some people will be shortlisted, and there will be an interview. So the interview is important. And I think in terms of the question of how to stand out, for me, the main thing is demonstrating potential for independence. What we're looking for in a PhD student is not just someone who's going to take instructions, but rather someone who is already beginning to come up with their own ideas. They don't need to have a fully formed project in mind, although some PhD applications will require you to write a project, but you will get help in that. Others might be even a PhD that already has a project sort of prefabricated, will want to look for people who are going to drive this project and really be proactive. So this has to be reflected in your application and also in the interview. So I think that's the sort of broad overview of what we're looking for, but I'm happy to expand on that as the other questions come.
Can I just add something, Hannah? So, I mean, I kind of have an unfair advantage because I was the first asked, and as you guys are saying stuff, I'm also reflecting on what you're commenting on. So please feel free to sort of do ta'qib alayya as well, to use an Arabic phrase. Okay, so one of the things which is quite important in an important distinction between the UK and the US. In the US, when you apply for a PhD, you won't get accepted unless they have funding for you. So every position for a PhD is a fully funded thing. Whereas in the UK, you can actually fund yourself. And in the humanities generally, as a consequence, in a sense, the bar for entry in the UK, even at a top university, is lower than that what you have in the US. But unless you're from independent means and you're or a wealthy background or something, it's really not feasible to sort of fund yourself. So most people will not pursue that. And I just want to highlight this distinction that, in a sense, it's easier to get into a university in the UK, even a place like Oxford, but it's far more difficult, I think. Maybe not far more difficult, but it's more difficult certainly than the US to get funding for a post, and that's something to bear in mind. And I just wanted to reiterate Mohammadi's point about independence. In the humanities, you're not working within a sort of lab or a team under a scientist. You are basically bringing your own project, and the amount of feedback you get from supervisors is absolutely minimal generally. Sometimes people not see their supervisors, they'll see their supervisors for an hour each month or something like that. I think that's actually potentially the only obligation you have in a place like Oxford. So it is really your project in a place like Oxford. And in the US system, usually a PhD has a built-in master's program, which is a taught program. And so there is, in a sense, more systematic professional development that takes place in the US system. But maybe I'm sort of, because I didn't do my PhD in the UK system, maybe I'm not fully aware of some of the things in the humanities that are available.
Can I take Usaama's invitation to add something? It's very similar with the economics actually. In the US, it's a much longer PhD. You're expected to do a PhD for about 6 years, and it's like a 2 years master's program built in, and they're pretty much all fully funded. I think no one would ever enter a program without funding. I mean, in the UK, similar to the humanities, they tend to be like 3-year PhDs, 4-year, although they do drag on a bit more these days. And people would start it with partial funding, do a bit of teaching on the side, but that's completely unheard of in the US. So this US-UK distinction is definitely the case in economics. And economics in the UK, generally, in Oxford, you'd already have identified a supervisor, you'd already be in touch with the supervisor, and then you'd kind of naturally gravitate to their group. I was seeing my supervisor like a few times every week, right? It was quite an intense relationship. But yeah, obviously in the US, if you're applying for a 6-year program, you wouldn't need to have a supervisor identified beforehand because you'd do the structured kind of master's program for 2 years.
Right. Okay, that's great to touch on that. That actually brings me nicely into the next question, which was this distinction between applying for a PhD in the US, because some of members in our audience are interested in doing a PhD there as well. And so you've all sort of touched on some of the differences there, but if I could go back to Dr. Usaama, if you could sort of talk about any key differences, in terms of the application process in the US and how that differs with UK. You've talked about funding, but any other aspects?
The application process, so before I go into the application process, I'll briefly say anyone who's interested in doing a humanities PhD in the US, get a book by Gregory Semenza called Graduate Studies in the 21st Century. Fantastic book, which really kind of outlines what you need to do once you're in the PhD program. But in terms of the actual application process, and my memory of this is a bit sort of faded now because it's over a decade ago. I'd say a couple of things. One is that, in the US system, it's not a good idea to apply with a fully formed project, whereas in the UK system, that's precisely what's expected of you. If you don't have a fully formed project, they'll basically be wondering, why are you applying for a PhD? You're supposed to figure that question out, and then come here and you're doing the implementation of that project. Despite what Mohammed was saying about you're not really actually going to stick to that exact project throughout. It's going to change, it's going to develop, etc. But in the US system, it's basically, you're not applying with a project per se. You can say, I'm interested in exploring this question, that question, etc. And this is probably, and you also don't want to identify one single supervisor there when you're applying, because in a sense, you want as many people on the admissions committee to fight for your entry. You could say, I'd like to study with such and such, such and such, such and such a scholar within the department. And it's possible that I will sort of pursue my doctorate with advice from all of them. And in a sense, that's a good move when it comes to applying to the US system. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are significant distinctions in terms of the application process, and it really differs from institution to institution. Princeton was the only place that I'm aware, which is where I did my PhD, that actually flew people out to do interviews, or I mean, even domestically, people would be flying because America is such a big country. And but most places, I think, just expect to see your application. So it's the strength of your, it's not entirely fair to call it a proposal, but it would be something like a statement of purpose, and it might be fairly detailed, alongside your reference letters. And perhaps a very important component is your writing sample in the humanities, because it's supposed to demonstrate whether or not you can basically, you'll be submitting something like 25 pages double-spaced, and it'll, you know, the closer that looks to something that is publishable, the better. So those, I think, probably would be the major considerations. I hope I've answered the question.
Great. Thank you very much. So, yeah, it seems like it is very much, there are different parameters that are important in the UK, and the different parameters are very important in the US. Seems like there is a board that you are trying to sort of penetrate into and get to be on your side in the US, whereas in the UK, it's very much, it's...
Can I add something, actually? So in the UK, if your supervisor wants, they have to be a permanent post holder in the department, if they want you to be accepted into the university in the humanities in a place like Oxford, that's more or less guaranteed you'll be accepted into the university. Whether you get funding or not depends on the strength of your application. That's where an entire board will be concerned. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, and it slipped my mind now, so it'll come back at some point, but okay.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Right, so there's some clear differences there to consider if you're looking at the US as opposed to the UK. So in the last panel, we talked about coming to the decision to make a PhD, when is the right time, and so on. And with all of you here, we have, alhamdulillah, we have the blessing that you've all come out the other end of the PhD now. So you have the sort of added advantage of sort of hindsight as well. So when it comes to after a PhD, what are the sorts of directions you can take with this? And how did this sort of shape your career compared to how you'd envisioned it before you applied for the PhD? And also in terms of different career options you can have in your specific field, do you feel your PhD has really added value and improved your career directions? Let's start with Mohamady, please.
Sure. So I want to just jump back to the previous question, because I thought there'd be a question in between. So just one thing that I wanted to highlight was in terms of the relative weight of application versus interview. I would say for the sciences, for the natural sciences, typically the application would be the first filter, and people who would reach the point where you'll be shortlisted for interview can be seen as more or less equal or on equal footing. And now you need to demonstrate that all of these interesting projects that you've said you've done, all of this extra reading that you've said you've done, you've obviously done it, but B, you've actually deeply engaged with it to the point that you demonstrate there's potential for independence. So a classic example, classic question that would come up in an interview would be, so you did this project on XYZ, tell us more about this, tell us more about your contribution to this. And if it's really clear from your answer that all you've done is just take some instructions, that's not going to make you very competitive. So what you need to show with all of these projects, A, when you're actually doing them, but also B, when you're preparing for the interview, you need to really have read clearly about the project, understood what the project was, understood what the big question was and what your part to that question was. And somehow, if possible, even link it to the project that you're applying for. So that was something that I just wanted to expand upon. Now, in terms of what comes after a PhD, I think a PhD opens up a number of avenues for you. So from a PhD, you can go on to continue in academia, of course, and do postdoctoral work with perhaps the aim of eventually becoming independent and having your own group if you're in the natural sciences. And you gradually become more and more responsible as you progress. So it becomes more about becoming independent. And actually, the sort of benchmark or the point at which people will refer to you as an independent researcher is when you have your own group. And so really if you want to continue in academia, the main thing that you're focusing on throughout your postdoctoral work is to build up your research portfolio to the point that you can get funded yourself for your own independent work. But PhD also opens up other routes and other careers for you. You'll be very competitive for consulting jobs, for example. You'll be very competitive for various kinds of industry jobs who will typically hire someone at that level. So because you've developed this independence as a PhD student, that kind of skill set, problem-solving skill set, and sort of proactivity is very attractive for various jobs.
Great, and that skill set is certainly very unique compared to anything you would have acquired at the bachelor or master level as well. So yeah, definitely thank you for that. Mohammed, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, I'll do what Mohammed did and jump back a couple of questions as well first. In terms of advice for economics PhD, like rightly or wrongly, to get into a top economics PhD program these days, you have got to have done a lot of maths in your studies, right? Whether undergrad or your master's level. You may not actually end up using the maths that much if you do like economic history or something like this, but it's used as a screening device, like who can do the maths and who can't do the maths, who can do stats, who can't do stats, right? So they generally advise you to do maths until it hurts, basically. And that's used as part of like the qualifying exams in many of these PhD programs. And so, you know, ultimately the topic that you maybe end up studying may not require you to use that much like formal kind of pure maths. Stats definitely it would, but you have to get through that painful process of the maths, right? So you basically have to do the maths till it hurts. And it may be that, you know, and I know from personal experience, like I started my PhD relatively late. It starts getting harder and harder to do maths proofs the older you get. Like that's just the fact, right? And so there probably is the right age to kind of put yourself through that pain. You know, when I hear Mohammed talk about like portfolio ownership and all of this stuff, that's not expected for an economics person until they go on the job market post PhD. That kind of like maturity of like having ideas, having like showing that you're going to be owning a portfolio and running a few things, rather than just a glorified RA for your supervisor. That's something that you're going to have to demonstrate towards the end of the PhD, and as you hit the job market, that you're not basically just an RA for your supervisor, and that you can run a kind of independent portfolio, bring in your own grants, etc. So you have to show that, but kind of more towards the end. In terms of like career options, I mean, the obvious one is it's always going to be investment banking, quantitative hedge funds, this kind of thing, consulting for anyone with economics PhD. That's industry, right? But then there's also working for the World Bank, the IMF, OECD, those kind of organizations. That's also a big point. And of course, academia, true. And the thing that these days, many people are doing quite data heavy kind of research as in an economics PhD, so dealing with like data analytics, econometrics, etc. And that can become very useful in a number of corporations as well. So many people end up working for Google, Facebook, analytics kind of division, running like small RCTs for these like large companies, Uber, etc. So there are quite a few options in that respect.
A broad range of options.
Yeah.
Should I briefly sort of reflect? And I am tempted to sort of go a little back as well, because I remembered what I wanted to mention, which is to make a very good impression. It does help, even though there are no interviews in most cases, if you go and visit the scholars in question in person. I think that allows to sort of, because a lot of these scholars will get, you know, dozens of applications, and to stand out, sometimes showing that degree of initiative, going and they can assess in an informal way the fact that you're familiar with the field, etc. I think that's quite important, or potentially quite important. And before I went applied to the US, I actually flew out there and visited 4 different universities and met with a number of scholars across those universities. And I think that did help. As a colleague of mine once put it, they can put a face to a name. Otherwise, just a number or a name on an application form. And the other thing, and this sort of, I don't encourage doing this in a mercenary fashion, do this in a scholarly fashion, but engage the scholars of the department that you're applying to. Like, try and look at their work, be familiar with it, and be able to, I mean, to a certain extent, there's a certain degree of flattery involved in this almost, that if you're taking their scholarship seriously, that's an obvious reason for you to go and want to study with them. And this probably goes back to a previous session, the first hour, but I remember this is good advice that I was given when I was in sort of undergraduate thinking about PhD. I was told by one of my teachers, who's now a colleague of mine, Christopher Melchert, in my department, that look at scholars whose writing you like, because and you would like to study with them because they will train you to write like them. So that's very much in the humanities. The sort of analysis that you'll engage in, the sorts of questions that you'll investigate will be similar to those that have been investigated and analyzed by previous scholars. To answer your question on careers, the humanities doesn't, I think, have quite as much latitude in terms of, as the sciences and perhaps even the social sciences. You generally in a sense, if you're doing a PhD in the humanities, especially in the US, you're doing this because you want to go into a career in academia. In the UK, I think, considering just how few jobs there are in the humanities overall, I think something like a majority of people who do humanities PhDs don't end up doing academic jobs. And for those sorts of people, I think there are sort of many other options, which I'm not very familiar with, but because I've come out of the US system and most of my colleagues are basically in academic jobs. But, going into industry, working in various kinds of, I have a colleague who didn't really finish his PhD, but he works in the civil service fostering, for example. And, similarly, going to Google, I have colleagues who, went from academia to the think tank world, and from the think tank world to Google. So I have a colleague who sort of is working in Google now from my department in Princeton. So those sorts of options are definitely available. I'm not the best person to ask on the details of that, but there are all sorts of options. One of the things, I'll close with this, that I recommend Muslims going into Islamic studies specifically, to think about they're doing a PhD in Islamic studies as a contribution to the knowledge in that field, which they may not be able to continue, on looking in academia and so on on that level, but they will at least have produced that sort of monograph, that 100,000 words on this discrete subject, which will be of benefit in the field of Islamic studies that other people can utilize in the future.
So that's a really key point as well. Absolutely. And that's something that, that the sort of Muslim Researchers Network, that's very much at the ethos of why we're pushing to have more Muslims in research contributing to this knowledge, and especially in the Islamic studies domain. Okay, so maybe
can I just add that I've actually, like myself, read many like doctoral theses of people who have done Islamic studies work, and they've ended up not in academia, but I've just found them like really useful references, and I know that people do, right? So like really reiterate the point that Usaama made, that you can actually make a big contribution even if you leave academia, because people do pick up your thesis like years later, right?
That's a really, really important point. That the PhD itself is a contribution within itself. So a little bit more about how to get onto this ladder, more specifically, a bit more from a pragmatic point of view. How do you go about contacting a PI or a professor or someone you've identified? And we touched on this a little bit in the first panel, but how much scope is there for you to sidestep into a domain you don't necessarily have background? And I think, Mohammed, you mentioned a little bit about these pre-docs that I'd never heard of previously, but how could you go about doing that practically and making a good impression?
I mean, it's in economics, the route is basically as an RA, right? You just need to get an RA job for someone and just prove that you can do the data work. You can like, you're good at cleaning data, managing data, analyzing data. You're organized, you're hardworking, etc. I mean, generally that's how people go in these days, is as an RA for someone else, get exposure to senior researchers and their methods, and go from there, really.
And how is that different in the sciences, Mohammed?
I think it's quite similar in the sense that you do have to get get a sort of hands-on experience typically before you apply for a PhD in something that is somewhat relevant. Doesn't need to be the exact topic, but you need to get some experience, for example, in data analysis, which in anything quantitative you need to start getting good at, or in the broad field that you're trying to get into. So something related to molecular biology, if you're going to do one of the various things that comes under that, including cancer research or virology or something else. So it's important to do that, and one way to do that is to become an RA. That's one way of doing it. It's not the only way. Certainly, a lot of people that that go into PhDs without experience as an RA, or having only done sort of summer projects. As to the question of how can you approach a PI, I think the best way is to in the initial email not send this sort of generic I would like to apply to your lab kind of email. You need to personalize it. You need to show evidence that you've read some of their work, you've understood it. If there's a specific aspect of it that you would like to work on, and then that's more likely to get you success. And then take it from there and be persistent. So, if they don't respond within a week, send another email. I always tell the story of how I got my PhD by basically calling my PI consistently for weeks on end until they eventually replied. And they were actually quite angry at me initially, but anyway, it worked in the end. And finally, sidestepping into a different field. So I've somehow done that, somewhat done that. So I started off in biochemistry, and I'm now a cognitive neuroscientist. So these two are very different fields within biology. It's been a little bit more gradual than that, in the sense that from my undergraduate in biochemistry, I moved on to a sort of neuroscience master's first, and then more of a systems neuroscience PhD, and eventually sort of moved all the way as far as possible as I can be from biochemistry into cognitive neuroscience. So it was a little bit gradual, but still at every step there had to be some extra reading, some extra evidence of doing projects that are relevant to the next step. So I think it's possible. It depends how far you're moving from your current field, but the further you're moving, the more you're going to have to do extra reading, extra work, basically.
Can I just pick up on something Mohamady said about these generic emails? Yeah, it's not a good idea. I mean, we probably all receive generic emails saying, "Oh, I'm really interested," and sometimes they're not even using our name, right? It's just idea. But I was just thinking when he was speaking, like, how do you approach someone in a kind of like substantial kind of way, right? Not just kind of a token kind of way. And if you actually read someone's work, and it touches on Usaama's point as well, right? Like if you read someone's paper and then you have like a specific question, maybe you have a correction for them, all right? Or a specific question, or follow up. There are often like loose ends in papers and projects and things like this. I mean, that's a really kind of like proper way to engage with someone, right? It's like, I was looking at your paper and I was thinking, could you take it in this direction, or what did you think about this thing? I mean, that's a really nice way of doing it, right? Potentially. And the persistence thing, absolutely, right? I mean, many academics are bad at replying to email and just keep going, like just keep trying them, right? Like you'll get annoyed, but at some point they'll be like, okay, this is the kind of person I want on the team, right? Because they're persistent.
Excellent, great. That's really good advice from both of you. So Mohamady being persistent, and Mohammed trying to really personalize your understanding of that person's research and building on it as well, because you're demonstrating great skill there in doing that.
You're going to have to remind me the question, because there's very interesting responses, but yes. Yeah,
so the question was effectively, how do you go about practically in terms of contacting a PI and, pitching yourself?
Right. So, I mean, of course, I'd say a couple of things. We don't work in PI terms generally in the humanities. We do have some scholars who are working as PIs for certain large projects, and that's how it works in the UK very often. But generally, it's really about sort of, and we don't have research assistantships and things like that in the humanities generally. There's not enough money slushing around, so to speak. That's often in the social sciences, like economics, and in the sciences, it's basically industry or very large and well-funded sort of research councils and so on, which are very often in large part funded by industry, that they are able to sort of subvene, so to speak, that sort of cost. In the humanities, the problem with the humanities is it doesn't make money, right? And so that's why, very few people go and do humanities PhDs in the grand scheme of things. It's people who are very passionate about what they're doing. And what you do is basically precisely what Mohammed was mentioning earlier. You're reading very broadly. And one of the things that Gregory Semenza, that book I mentioned earlier, he says early on in that text that, look, if you can't read, he's talking about sort of a novel. If you can't read a novel cover to cover, and I'd say if you can't read an academic book cover to cover and enjoy it and enjoy that process and do that repeatedly week after week after week, you probably don't want to become an academic, right? You may still want to do a PhD for 3 or 4 years of your life. You might not enjoy it as much, but you might do it just as, that contribution to knowledge. But you read, in terms of approaching scholars, you read their material, you really are reflective and you read broadly and are able to engage. You have some familiarity with what a field looks like. You're able to engage, and then through that process, you have these questions that come up that you want to engage that scholar on. And that's just a wonderful hook to get them, sort of to reel them in, so to speak, because there's nothing more gratifying for a scholar than to have their ideas seriously grappled with by intelligent people. And so, that's one thing I would definitely say. And there's another point that Mohammed mentioned, which it slipped my mind again. But, I do think that there has to be that genuine sort of engagement with issues. And that is what will translate into effective engagement with a scholar. If you're interested in a certain scholar and you want to apply to a PhD in the UK, for example, with them, you usually will contact them directly and get to know them, develop a relationship, and they will actually have a read of your proposal in advance of your submitting it. They will usually ask for your CVs and things like that, just so that they're familiar with, what you're doing, and they might say, yes, I think this is something that you can do, and yes, I think, you should go ahead and apply. And I don't know, I'm not a permanent staff member, so I don't accept PhD students myself, but I don't know if they're allowed to signal to applicants in advance that apply for this and you will be accepted. But if you want to get funding, you need to do this, 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 and this to make yourself competitive. So that's how it would look in the UK. And in the US, as I've already mentioned, you're pitching to a department rather than a single scholar. Yeah.
Great. Excellent. Thank you so much. We've got one question that's been coming up a lot. It's about sort of work-life balance as a PhD or in academia. Mohamady, if we start with you, could you sort of shed some light on that sort of work-life balance and juggling different interests as well?
Absolutely, yeah. The first thing to say is that this is a really important question that you have to think about early on, and it's not a trivial thing to say because many of us don't really give it its due worth. But you do need to think about having a work-life balance, both for the quality of your life, but for the quality of your work as well. And I think there's no easy sort of answer to it other than to constantly be trying to improve it, basically. I've spoken before about this. So from my own personal experience, during my PhD, I had very little work-life balance, and that was purely out of choice. So, I felt that there was a need for me to be there a certain amount of hours, come in a certain weekends on a sort of regular basis. And from experience, I think that wasn't an efficient way of doing the work. And it certainly wasn't healthy. So I sort of learned from that experience and alhamdulillah improved as I progressed from the PhD. But my advice to people is to sort of not make the same mistakes, really try and look at some of these successful scientists in PI, and you can see some of them have very strict boundaries when it comes to work and life. There are surely ones that seem to have very little life and work on weekends, but there are others who are equally, if not more successful, who I've seen, people nominated for Nobel Prizes, who strictly finish at 5 p.m., go home, spend the time with their kids, never come on weekends. They do exist. but they're very, very disciplined, and they make sure that they work very hard during the time that they're there, and they're very efficient. So you need to spend a lot of time thinking about how to be more efficient rather than just how to be in the lab for longer. And it's something that you will get better at, but only with sort of proactivity. It's not just going to come spontaneously.
Excellent, thank you. Some great advice there in terms of juggling that and making sure your time is actually productive as well. And Mohammed, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was on a panel with Mohamady recently on marriage and what balancing that life as well. And it's a similar thing. Like when I was younger, I used to like regularly put in like 14, 15-hour days at work, and even during the DPhil. And when you have other responsibilities in your life and you have other, you can't be selfish like that anymore. Like you can't just have that focus on work and nothing else, and it requires you to be more efficient. Like Mohammed said, like you just have to say, listen, I can dedicate a smaller proportion of my day to work, but I have to do it more efficiently. I have to cut out the slack, right? I have to identify which areas of my lifestyle are not really essential. But yeah, I've struggled with this work-life balance throughout my life, which is basically just too much work. And at the moment, it's kind of a bit of a struggle as well with teaching and supervision and admissions and things like this. And like you have, like you think, okay, maybe I should just sleep less, right? Maybe I should just sleep less to stay on top of all this work, to stop myself drowning. But you just go crazy, right? So at some point, it's like Mohammed said, you have to be like efficient. You have to just realize that I have to close the inbox at some point. Like I might be flooding with emails, right? But I just have to shut the inbox and switch off, because otherwise I'm just going to go mad, So, and everyone's got advice for good coping mechanisms, and you should speak to as many people as possible about which coping mechanisms they use, because they're different for different people, right?
And Usaama, mashallah, you've also got a family as well. So anything you'd like to add?
Sure. I mean, what I'd say is this is not actually necessarily just a problem of academia, although this is something that definitely exists in academia, but it's a problem of the way in which the global economy is set up, and the way in which capitalism operates right now, and the levels of inequality it creates, and the fact that at the bottom, that is basically the 99%, we really are in a kind of rat race, and you can never make it to the top. You can never make it to the place where you can finally rest. And the system is, I think, designed to create those conditions. So there are more systemic questions to address, in a sense, in which academia, with the, what some scholars refer to as the corporatization of the university, reflects a lot of those sorts of, things, unfortunately. But at the same time, there are ways to ameliorate those sorts of pressures, and we will have, differing levels of success. I think particularly early on in our careers, and I'm in my mid to late 30s, and I've got 2 children, both under the age of 2 and under, and I'm in lockdown with them for the last year, and it's extremely difficult to get work done. And so alhamdulillah, I have, in a sense, a bit of a luxury that I have a DL, a departmental lectureship, which is rolling over, inshallah. And so, that's a very different scenario to most people on the academic job market this year, facing an absolutely decimated array of jobs. And so I think in those sorts of circumstances, I actually have benefited a lot from, using self-help literature. Personally, like there's a great book which I used as a PhD student called Writing Your Dissertation 15 Minutes a Day, and it's for the humanities, but by someone called Joan Bolker. But it also gives a lot of advice on how to just balance the mental health concerns, because in academia, and particularly in PhDs, there's a huge amount of mental health or mental health dysfunction, shall we say, just in the way that things are structured, unfortunately. And it's also the fact that in the humanities in particular, you're usually working in an isolated fashion. So, I'm very blessed that I actually finished my PhD while I was married. I don't know if my wife would see that as a blessing, right? But in the sense that, you know, I had human interaction on a regular basis. The fact that I had a child, you know, at the point I was defending my dissertation, was also something which, you know, just gave me a sense of reality, right? This obsession that I have with finishing these 80,000 to 100,000 words need to be put in perspective as well, right? You know, I actually mentioned that in the acknowledgements of my dissertation. I was like, you know, my wife having a child in my final year of my dissertation writing just gave me a sense of perspective. So, you know, it's those sorts of things. And I'm someone who is quite a happy advocate of self-help literature and these sorts of things, whether it's academic, whether it's sort of more general mental health, mental self-help. So yeah, I would suggest all this. Although I'll just caveat that the entire industry of self-help is a facet of the dysfunction of the systems that we work within, unfortunately. Yeah.
That's a useful caveat, actually. But Jazakallah khair, mashallah, that's lovely advice. We've got lots of different questions here. I'm trying to group them slightly in the interest of time. One question here, which I think has come in a couple of times now, is how do you choose between a subject that you are very, very passionate in versus a subject that is probably more favorable in terms of career prospects and more likely to get you a job? So if we go back to our Mohamady, maybe?
Yeah, I just want to jump in with that. Something I feel quite strongly about. I don't know if the panelists will agree with me, but I'll just give my 2 cents on that. I think the way that I think of this question is that you need to, the first filter that you need to apply is, am I interested in this? This has to be the first filter. Again, it's not, I don't think of it as a weighing between the two. I think one has much more weight, and that is, am I interested in this? The reason being is that academic work is driven by the academic. It's driven by your own sort of interest and pursuit of this knowledge. And so this is a question that you're not interested in, then that creates problems both in terms of the quality of your work, but also in terms of your own sort of mental well-being and happiness and drive and motivation. If it's not something that you're passionate about, then that's already something that needs to not feature in your applications at all. Once you've identified a bunch of things that you're interested in, a group of things that you're interested in above a certain threshold, then you can choose based on other criteria. For example, is this a hot topic? Is this something that's highly funded? Is it going to provide me with a good work-life balance? I would say the criteria of you being passionate about something should come first, and all other considerations should come after that.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much.
I would agree. I mean, the am I interested thing for me would be like a necessary but insufficient condition, right? So like, if you're not interested in the topic, just like for me, that's a non-starter, right? But then, as Mohammed said, there's a bunch of things that you're interested in, and so that's like a necessary condition, but it's insufficient, right? Because then you have these other considerations in place, right? And there's this theory in economics. It's a theory of like trade. Actually, it's the theory of comparative advantage. It's the theory that, you know, you could probably do a lot of things very well. Like I'm sure, you know, you're all very smart. You could probably do many things well, right? But which thing can you like comparatively do better in? That's one thing to consider as well, right? And I'd be keen to hear Usaama's opinion on this, because if I recall correctly, either reading his biography or him discussing his biography with me, he was previously like considering medicine or something, and then he decided in Islamic studies. So I think this idea of like comparative advantage is quite important as well. How you add value and what value is subjective, right? But
yeah, it's very subjective. Jazakallah khair, Mohamady. I mean, both Mohamady and Mohammed really, you know, I just wanted, before I get to your point, Mohammed, just want to say this question I don't think arises quite as much in the humanities, because, you know, if you're not interested in the subject, you wouldn't be pursuing a PhD. Although some people might have sort of a very low bar for what counts as interest. So they're like big, I'm a Muslim and I'm interested in Islamic studies because I'm a Muslim, but they don't have necessarily a substantive scholarly interest. So I just qualify that as, if you have a specific scholarly interest in Islamic studies or in the humanities more generally, that compels you to constantly be reading in the area, then that is as Mohammed mentioned a necessary but insufficient condition. You also have to have other skills, etc. I mean, in my particular subject, Islamic Studies, perhaps one of the most important things is your ability to use primary source languages. So Arabic most importantly, but also other languages. If you're coming from the Indian subcontinent, Urdu might be very valuable as well. Turkish, Persian, all of these sorts of languages are useful. Just on, the point Mohammed mentioned, and I've discussed with friends in the past that, I actually, I'm Asian, like any good Asian. I studied physics, chemistry, biology, and maths at A-level, and I took deferred entry into medicine at Imperial College. And in a sense, I never sort of really felt bad about that until the pandemic hit, but that's a different story. So sometimes what is, I think Aristotle or Plato say that eudaimonia, or the notion of happiness, is sometimes contingent on factors that are completely beyond one's control and they change over time. So, I was perfectly happy with my choices until the pandemic hit. And then I was thinking, is this really the most valuable thing that I'm doing right now? But, that's a momentary, everyone has these momentary existential questions that come up. I personally, after I studied Arabic for a year on my deferred, year out, as I was supposed to go into study medicine, I basically came across something which, I couldn't really do anything else with my life after that. I came across Arabic and Islamic Studies, and I thought that not just that I'm very interested in this, but I also thought that there's a far greater need for people with expertise in these sorts of areas than within the Asian community medicine, because like everyone and their brother's doing medicine, right? And I'm not to disparage medicine because it's such a crucial field, obviously, but I think that in terms of the comparative advantage, there is some benefit to coming into Islamic Studies, but on the other hand, and I'm going to mention another book for people who are thinking about sort of the humanities PhD very seriously, there are very few jobs out there. Like I have a student who was saying that one of my colleagues was telling them, don't do a PhD because there are no jobs out there. And she's a relatively high-flying sort of like professor, the colleague who was recommending this to one of my students. And I basically said, well, you're doing this as kind of, because you're Muslim and you're interested in these questions, I would say this is kind of like a sadaqah that you're giving to the Muslims, to the Muslim ummah, in a sense, through your engagement with these ideas. And then you can move on to other fields. But the book I was going to mention is by someone called Hume, I forget her first name, Surviving the Academic Job Hunt. And it's very much, geared towards humanities in the US, humanities PhDs in the US, but it's ruthless out there when it comes to looking for jobs afterwards. So those are also things to bear in mind when it comes to the question of, am I interested in, just on the question of interest, if you can't, demonstrate your interest in reading in these fields, then you're not going to last those 4 years that you're looking forward to doing a PhD for. But afterwards, the possibility of getting a job when you're not interested in it, and maybe you've not developed a significant interest, will be even, lower than people who are genuinely driven and interested in those fields. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
That's brilliant. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you very much. We're receiving a lot of slightly more specific questions. Some of you are mentioning what it is you specifically want to apply for, and recommendations for specific things to your personal case. That brings us on very nicely to something that Mohamady will discuss in a second, but I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists for your time and for your invaluable insight, really, on these topics that we don't often get the opportunity to discuss as much. So thank you very much for your time and for being candid and honest.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Mohamady now, who is one of the co-leads on the Muslim Researchers Network, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that and some of the services that it offers, which will be highly valuable to all of you tuning in right now. And then after that, we'll have a short break before we move on to our third and last session, which will be on a workshop on how to write a sort of PhD proposal and whatever. So please do stay tuned for that if that is of interest to you. So Mohamady, over to you.
Thanks very much, Hannah. And yeah, thank you very much for all the panelists so far. It's been brilliant to share this platform with you. I just wanted to talk very briefly about the Muslim Researchers Network, who have co-organized this event today. So I'm going to just share my screen with our newly made website. Hannah, can you see the website?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So just very briefly, we are aiming to be a platform that promotes progress and excellence in academic research amongst Muslims. And we organize events like this one and like the annual research conference that's been happening over the past 3 years. But also we've started to really utilize this website for a number of schemes. Now, one of these is the mentorship scheme. Now, today we heard from some academics from various fields about quite general advice about how to apply to PhDs and how to find the right supervisor and so on. But if you'd like more tailored advice, we have the mentorship scheme, which we've recently started. So if you go to muslimresearchersnetwork.org and then navigate to the mentorship, you'll start to see that we've started to build up a portfolio of number of mentors, which is currently growing. So what you can do here is you can sort of find out about whether there's a mentor that is of interest to you. Well, currently we only have 4, but this is going to grow over the next few weeks, inshallah. And then what you can do is scroll down and sort of sign up to be mentored by someone on this scheme. And so you enter your details, you tell us which mentor or mentors you're interested in being mentored by, and then we can then put you in touch with this academic. So this is especially useful if you've got an application coming up. And so please tell us in this section here about any upcoming applications and give us as much detail as is relevant. So this is sort of the most relevant aspect of the website to today's event, but there are other aspects of the website that are also useful and interactive. So for example, you can contribute to the website by publishing an article. And this is really aimed at articles that are going to be widely accessible to a lay audience. So we're not looking for specific field-related publications. We're looking for an article where you describe your research in a way that everyone can read and everyone can sort of appreciate. And so we've got a couple of articles up already from our members. So this is this is an opportunity for you to showcase your work. And other than that, there are other parts of the website that you might be interested in. For example, you can find out about our meetings and see media from previous conferences. And you can also contact us and follow us on various social media platforms by coming over here. And one of the ways that we would like you to sort of help us improve this is to basically give us any suggestions, whether it's about the mentorship scheme or about any other aspect of our work. And so you can do that via the contact us page. So yeah, in a nutshell, this is the website. This is what we do. Please do stick around. There's still 1 more hour of our third section coming up. And yeah, I'll hand back over to Hannah.
Okay, Jazakallah khair, Mohamady, for that introduction into the MRN. I do encourage everybody here to take a look at the website, do sign up to the mailing list, and do keep an eye on all the different range of services that Mohamady just talked us through. Right, so we'll take a break now, a slightly longer break, about 15 minutes. If you go and stretch your legs, get a drink, write some notes and all the wonderful things you've just heard, and we'll resume at 3:20. And this is for those of you who are interested in the dedicated workshops that we'll be having on how to write an application proposal for a PhD. So, Jazakallah khair, and see you at 20 past.